So thank you for joining me today. During our time together, I hope to share with you some fresh ideas about writing, including global features and trends that often go unnoticed. Nowadays, we all live in a world saturated with writing. We're surrounded by large displays and posters and traffic signs. Over the past 20 years, we've even come to consider it normal to send to each other written messages instantaneously through space. To readjust our perspective a bit, let's go back to a time when writing was still relatively new and less common. As you can tell, we've landed in ancient Egypt. We see Rosetta in her studio, laboring over a stone that she's inscribing with a royal decree. In school, Rosetta had excelled in Greek as a second language and in history too. When it came time to give instructions to the installation team, she told them to place the stone where Napoleon's soldiers would run into it 2,000 years later. Nowadays, the Rosetta Stone is housed at the British Museum in London. Though this photo makes it look like it's floating in midair, don't worry, it's not. The stone weighs 1,600 pounds or 700 kilograms. As you can see, it's damaged at the top. It was already in that condition when Napoleon's soldiers found it near the shore of the Mediterranean town of Rashid, or Rosetta, in the European version of the name. Notice that it's divided into 3 sections. The top part shows hieroglyphic writing, then that's the most damaged part. The middle section contains demotic writing, and the bottom is inscribed in Greek. So here we see magnification of a portion of each of the sections. The word hieroglyphic and demotic, the words hieroglyphic and demotic are Greek terms for 2 styles of Egyptian writing. Hieroglyphic means sacred script. The writing contained many pictorial symbols. Demotic refers to the writing of the people, demos, which is the root in the word democratic. Its signs are more abstract and not pictorial. The Greek style is all uppercase uncial. Actually, at the time, that was the norm. There were no other forms. There was no lowercase. You might be wondering why there's also Greek writing on an Egyptian stone. After Alexander the Great had conquered Egypt around 300 BC, it came to be ruled by a Greek Macedonian family called the Ptolemies. They introduced Greek as the official language of government in Egypt. We speak of that period as Ptolemaic Egypt, and it's the beginning of the Greco-Roman period in Egyptian history. At the time of the discovery of the stone, scholars could read only the Greek section. Egyptian writing had not been deciphered yet. No one knew what the other 2 parts meant. Many European scholars believed that Egyptian hieroglyphics were magical symbols that the priests had invented to keep knowledge to themselves. The French scholar Champollion and several others thought that was nonsense. They firmly believed that the text represented the Egyptian language. Champollion is generally credited with deciphering the writing, but he also benefited from the work and attempts of many others. Like any classically trained scholar at the time, he knew Greek. He had also studied Coptic, the later stage of the Egyptian language, and that gave him some idea of its sounds and structure. He followed the reasonable hypothesis that the 3 sections basically said the same thing in 3 different writings. This was one of the keys that finally led to the decipherment of Egyptian writing. The Greek extract shown here refers to King Ptolemy in yellow, as you can see in the stock section. And in Greek, in this bottom section here, the text says Basileos Ptolomaios, which means King Ptolemy. Based on existing information, Champollion guessed that the hieroglyphic enclosed in the cartouche above here referred to a royal name, and most likely the same. Elsewhere on the stone, there was another cartouche, a similar cartouche, and a mention of Cleopatra in the Greek text. As the first part of decipherment, Champollion worked out that the hieroglyphic symbols in the cartouche were partially alphabetic. You can see here, this was his guess, Ptolmes, so Ptolemies. As you can see, this is going from right to left, and thus the reason is that in hieroglyphics could be written in either direction, left to right or right to left. We could say that Champollion took the first of 1,000 small steps towards full decipherment. On the Rosetta Stone, we've seen two styles of Egyptian writing, hieroglyphic and demotic. On this slide, we're seeing 4 styles that represent the Egyptian language written on papyrus instead of being inscribed in stone. The names for these styles are Greek in origin. So over here, we see hieroglyphic, sacred symbols. And as you can see, it has many signs in it that are recognizably pictographic. Serpent, bird, human sitting, etc. Hieratic is a priestly style, which we have here, and it corresponds to the hieroglyphics, its equivalent, but the symbols are more abstract. They're not pictorial anymore. Demotic is a similar, simplified style, and it's the style of the people. These 3 styles developed in time as more and more people were learning to write. So it began with the hieroglyphic, continued with hieratic, and then demotic. Coptic, which resembles Greek quite a bit, is an alphabet based on the Greek alphabet with additional letters for sounds that are exclusively in Egyptian. The style here is identical to Greek writing at the time. Later on, other distinctively Egyptian styles would develop. In time, all 3 forms of Egyptian writing died out except for the alphabetic form in the Coptic alphabet. It turned out that deciphering Egyptian writing was an extremely difficult task simply because it was a complex system. The demotic and hieratic forms of the writing turned out to be mostly visual simplifications of the hieroglyphic. In its most developed stage, how did hieroglyphic writing work? So we're seeing a symbol here which pictorially depicts a house, and it's pronounced as pur, as best as we know. Here, the pictorial symbol represents itself. So you see something that looks like a house, and it represents house. In the second form of writing, we see symbols. We see these 4 symbols here, which have direct meanings by themselves. From top to bottom, they mean woman, legs, sun, and house. And we see each of them having a secondary role as a category. So woman can represent a female person. For example, if I wrote a name, Nancy, and I wanted to make sure it was clear that this was woman, I would follow that by a categorical symbol that means female person. Legs can imply walking, running, or moving. Sun can imply light or time. House can imply dwelling, place. So this is the second way of using hieroglyphics. Thirdly, hieroglyphics can be used in an alphabetic sense as well. So here we have a list of the various hieroglyphics and the sounds that they represent when considered to be alphabetic. All the sounds that are shown here are consonants or semi-consonants. There are no plain vowels like o, or so on. Many tourists visiting Egypt today come away with a cartouche pendant that shows their names using this alphabet, and maybe some of you have that. There are also two other sets of symbols that represent 2 consonants and 3 consonants for each symbol. So we see that the Egyptians had some concept of the alphabet. So if you are reading a text of Egyptian hieroglyphics, you need to decide, as you are reading on the go, which symbols are intended in which of the 3 modes: pictorial, category, or alphabetic. Of course, the text usually contained some hints to help the reader. So why are we talking about ancient Egyptian writing, even though it's extinct? We're talking about it because it leads us to the first alphabet. You've just seen that alphabetic writing was a part of ancient Egyptian script. So why then aren't the ancient Egyptians credited with the invention of the alphabet? And the reply is that it's because they never wrote their language exclusively with alphabetic characters. This was either by choice or through lack of insight. We don't know. However, we know that it was in the Egyptian environment that the first alphabet was born. The Sphinx that you see in this picture was found in the first years of the 20th century at the site of an ancient Egyptian turquoise mine in Sinai, a place called Sarabat el-Khadam. With the exception of one hieroglyphic character here at the top, the symbols on the Sphinx are alphabetic letters that give a reasonable interpretation if read in a Canaanite language. And when I say Canaanite language, I'm talking in general about languages in the Eastern Mediterranean. The phrase can be interpreted as an homage to the deity Baalat, represented here in the figure of the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Several of the alphabetic symbols resemble the signs of hieroglyphics. In the same vicinity, other rocks were engraved with additional symbols. And here's a whole bunch of them laid out. This alphabet came to be called Proto-Sinatic. Now, let me clarify, Sinatic here, it refers to Sinai. Who invented this alphabet? It's a nameless person, literate or illiterate, we don't know, but it was somebody familiar with Egyptian symbols, someone who spoke a Canaanite language. So allow me to give him a nice Canaanite name like Ahiram. Ahiram must have been a very clever, intuitive fellow. If he was a migrant laborer, it's unlikely that he had any time for evening courses in phonetics at the Sinai Institute of Mining. Let's think about his accomplishments for a moment. What did he achieve? He identified every consonantal sound in his native language and matched it to a unique symbol. He named every letter after its visual image. So when you see a symbol and say its name, its first letter tells you what it stands for. This is similar to A for apple, B for boy, C for cat, D for dog. Imagine if that had been, if those had been the names of the English, of the letters in the English alphabet. For example, the house symbol was called bet and stood for the B sound. Here's an example of the house symbol. Finally, here are some of the sound values of the Proto-Semitic alphabet. The middle column shows the varying shapes known for each character, as well as the simplified forms that later appeared in the Phoenician alphabet. The transition from the pictorial Proto-Semitic forms to Phoenician took hundreds of years. For a variety of reasons, some scholars prefer to call this alphabet Canaanite instead of Phoenician. For simplicity's sake, I'll just use the popular term of Phoenician. So you can see, for example, at the top here, the symbol which is called Aleph and represents the head of an ox, appeared in these various forms. In the end, after hundreds of years of simplification, it took this form. And you can see our capital A in this letter. It's still very similar. You can also see here the B, etc., etc. So basically, the simplification tended here to the right. You can see the many different wiggles here were reduced in the end to 3. Fish became this symbol. I became a simple circle. And some of these forms look recognizable to this day from the Roman alphabet. Through the long transition from Proto-Semitic to Phoenician, which you are seeing here, it's a Phoenician inscription, symbols became simpler in form and were no longer pictorial. So the trick used in the very beginning to teach people the alphabet by having each symbol being a picture of some word disappeared, and it became an abstract alphabet before spreading elsewhere. Here we're looking at a map of the Mediterranean. On the eastern side here is where Phoenician writing developed. And then through trade, the Phoenician alphabet spread in the Mediterranean, and many derivative alphabets sprang up in the various areas. Now, these did not spring up like plants. They were adopted by people who made various changes to them, took the forms and changed them. So the Greeks adopted the basic forms, changed some, added some, and came up with this script. Here you see a very ancient form of Greek, but it's written right to left. This was quite common. In fact, there are texts that are both right to left and left to right. So they go to the end of the line and then weave back. Over here, we see derivative that later became the Latin alphabet. Likewise, down here. In the Turkish area, Anatolia, we see this writing, which eventually became extinct. Many alphabets were derived from Phoenician, not just Greek, as the story is often told. Varieties of Greek also developed. There was a transition from archaic to classical Greek, and it reflected changes in pronunciation and differences in dialects. In the end, the Athenian model won the competition and led to a surge in Greek classical literature. Now for the Italic scripts, those are the scripts in the Italian peninsula. There were many alphabets, such as the Etruscan, the Umbrian, the Latin. They all shared many common features. In the end, the Latin or Roman alphabet won out because of Rome's dominance as a state. Here we get some idea of the comparison of letter forms between Phoenician and Older Greek in the Attic region. The Attic region is where Athens is located. As you can see, the form of the A's, the A on its side here was taken and made upright. The bet developed into the various forms of the beta. And many of the forms here are recognizable to this day. The names of the letters were kept from Phoenician, but they were meaningless in Greek. Several Greek letters shown here were used by ancient Greek, but got dropped due to changes in pronunciation at a later time. So for example, we see the symbol koppa, we see the symbol, what else am I looking for here? Digamma, where is Digamma? Here, that also you recognize the F here. It disappeared because it stood for W in ancient Greek, which disappeared. Because the Greeks included vowels in their alphabet, it is often called a full alphabet, and it's called the first full alphabet. If you remember, the Phoenician and Egyptian alphabets were all made up of consonants. Now, beyond the initial period, let's look a bit at the spread and the influence of the Greek alphabet. If you consider this area here being Greek, we see the Greek text. Towards the north in the Balkans, these two scripts, Glagolitic and early Cyrillic, were invented for the Southern Slavic languages, and then from there were taken northeast for Russian and other closely related languages. To the south, in Egypt, Coptic became the script for Egyptian and eventually replaced the hieroglyphic writing. Northwest, we see the development of the Gothic language, which was a Germanic language, and the script, which strongly resembles Greek, also died out. To the east, we see the development of the Georgian and the Armenian alphabets based on the Greek model, but not based on the forms of Greek. Alexandria, Egypt held huge collections of Greek writing and became a focal center for innovation in all fields of endeavor. So here we see the compounded effect of a fully developed script for representation of literature and the sciences. By the time of the Roman period, Greek had become the common language or lingua franca of the Mediterranean basin. And when I talk about the basin, I mean all the countries surrounding the Mediterranean waters. Now, Phoenician or Canaanite also influenced the spread of writing in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we were focusing previously on the western portion and northern portion of the Mediterranean. Now let's focus on the east. We still see the Phoenician as the origin of many different derivations, but let's examine 4 specific alphabets that are worth noting. All 4 were used to write Semitic languages related to Phoenicians, so cousin languages to Phoenician or Canaanite. The Semitic family of languages today includes Arabic, Hebrew, and Amharic. So this is a family of languages that has a very, very long history. Here we see the Aramaic script. This script eventually got adopted as the administrative language and script for the Persian Empire. It spread eastward as far as India and Afghanistan. Variants adapted to languages from unrelated families, such as Persian. It was used from Egypt to India. So it had a huge spread as an official language of empires. Samaritan. This is the Samaritan script here. It's also known as Ancient Hebrew. This was the script originally used for the Hebrew language, but was later abandoned for a variant of Aramaic. So here we're not talking about replacing one language with another. We're talking about replacing a writing system with another, a script with another script. Thirdly, we see South Arabian, which was used for the languages of Southern Arabia, down here at the bottom where Yemen is today. Later on, when the Saba people immigrated to the Horn of Africa across here, they took their script with them. There it turned into a new kind of script, as we will see a bit later. So this script has a very interesting history. At the top here, we see the odd script in the family. If you've ever seen Babylonian writing, Mesopotamian writing, it was written with wedges in clay. As both script and language, Ugaritic was discovered only in the early 20th century in northern Syria. As you can see, it looks like Mesopotamian writing, cuneiform, or needle writing, as it was called. In fact, this clay tablet is a list of ABCs. It's called an abecedary. Abecedary. It's a list of the 29 consonants of the alphabet for the Ugaritic language. It follows the same structure of other derivatives of Proto-Semitic script, but the letter shapes are Mesopotamian in origin. The Ugaritic alphabet reflects the split in sound repertoires among Semitic languages. It has a large set of 29 consonants and is similar in its sound repertoire to South Arabian, while Aramaic as a language had reduced to 22 sounds. The discovery of Ugaritic literature has been useful in interpreting the Hebrew scriptures because of the similarity between the two languages. Ugaritic later vanished for unknown reasons. Finally, Ugaritic demonstrates that the concept of an alphabet as a list of all sounds of a language had taken root even when the forms of the letters were no longer pictorial. Is the idea of a sound, a finite collection of sounds represented each by a unique symbol. That idea became fixed, and we can see it in Greek, we can see it in Aramaic, we can see it in Coptic, where the symbols are no longer pictorial, but the concept of an alphabet as a closed list became established. After the collapse of the Persian Empire, several offshoots of Aramaic script developed. So we're moving up in time here to about the turn of the beginning of the Common Era, 0 AD, basically, or close to that. So we see five scripts here, and we're going to talk a little bit about each one. Let's look first at the Hebrew script. After a period of exile in Mesopotamia, the Jewish people abandoned use of the older Samaritan alphabet and developed a special style of Aramaic script called Hebrew square script. So this form that you see here is a derivative, was derived from Aramaic script. At the same time, the Hebrew language began its decline as the daily language and was replaced by Aramaic. However, Hebrew remained the religious language. The Hebrew sacred scriptures were written in the New Hebrew script, as evidenced by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What you see up here is a piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the following 2 millennia, Hebrew script was also adapted by Jewish communities in writing various regional languages, such as Arabic, Yiddish, and Ladino. In the late 19th century, Hebrew script was adopted for the newly revived Hebrew language. Next, let's look at Syriac writing up here. Although it's not well known today, the Syriac language and its script have left an indelible mark on modern civilization. During the peak of their civilization, the Syriac people developed a rich literary culture, and their language came to be highly esteemed in the Levant. Levant is the East Mediterranean. In addition to their own writings, a significant body of Greek texts were translated into Syriac. The sample shown here is from a translation of a work by the Greek physician Galen. So, interestingly enough, later on, many of the Syriac versions of Greek texts were translated into Arabic, reviving knowledge that had been lost to Europe for centuries. When they were finally translated to Latin, these texts became part of the body of knowledge that fed the Renaissance. Next, we're going to look at Nabatean writing. The Nabateans were an Arabic-speaking people who continued the tradition of writing their records in Aramaic. So they spoke Arabic, but they wrote in Aramaic, just as they had under the Persian Empire. Their kingdom was situated along trading routes in what is now Jordan. So from China and Central Asia to Jordan, they followed this path, and the Nabatean kingdom was roughly in this location. After the Romans destroyed the Nabatean kingdom, Nabatean script was slowly transformed into the ancestral form of Arabic writing. Many scholars believe that Syriac script also influenced the early style of fully formed Arabic script, which we come to now. This is an early style of Arabic. As the Arab Empire expanded in North Africa, and this would be in this direction, westward, the Levant and further eastward, the Arabic language and script gained dominance and gradually overtook Syriac. Because of its spread over a broad geographic area, many regional styles of Arabic script were developed. Various periods of artistic endeavor led to unprecedented refinement of its letter forms. Over the centuries, Arabic script was adapted to the writing of a large number of unrelated languages. And when I say unrelated languages, I mean unrelated to Arabic. So we've spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean now. Why don't we go off to China to look at a drastically different ancient writing system? The Chinese writing tradition is one of the few for which we have a good record of its long transitional stages, from the fully pictorial to the abstract. So here, in this chart, we're really seeing a progression in time. This is what symbols look like today in modern Chinese. Here we have the earliest period of the symbols, and they're quite pictorial at this point. For example, here's the symbol for woman, and we see it progress through the various stages, through various styles, until it ends up in the partially cursive and standard style, which are the basis for modern writing and typography. Very few writing systems can be traced across so many stages, but it's not that this is old knowledge. This is knowledge only acquired in the past century or so. There are three main types of Chinese characters. Here we begin with the idiographs. So idiographs means a symbol that suggests an idea or concept. Here we see the symbols, the idiographs for sun, for moon, for tree, and for horse. These symbols represent themselves. When you see this, it means sun. Next, we look at compound idiographs. That means more than one ideograph combined with another to create a new one. So if you remember, we have just seen the symbol for tree. Now we see the symbol for forest, which originally was composed of two trees. We saw the symbols for sun and moon. Here we see the same two symbols combined into a single ideograph, and it's abstract. It means bright. So we see how we can begin. The Chinese system allows this kind of compounding to create new meanings. The third type of Chinese character is a phonosemantic ideograph. What does phonosemantic mean? It's a complicated way of putting meaning and sound together. So phono means sound, and semantic means meaning. So let's look at this. How is the word mother composed? The word mother is composed out of two parts. The first part on the left here means female person. So we get the meaning from this first section, the semantic part. And then the second part is the symbol for horse. And it says the word for horse is roughly pronounced ma. Forgive me, I don't speak Chinese if I have the wrong tone. So it says this is a word for female person that sounds like ma, which is the way of saying mother. So put together, we have this symbol that gives us a pictorial hint and a sound hint. So meaning hint, sound hint. The second symbol, washing hair, is composed of moisture or water and sounds like mu, okay? The third symbol, which stands for pine tree, begins with a tree, and then for the sound portion, sounds like gong. I think actually it said song, something like that. So these are hints. Put together, you can see how one can compose new ideographs. And what's interesting about this category, the meaning and sound category, is that in modern Chinese, this represents more than 90% of all the characters used in regular text. So the first element hints at a category in general, the second element hints at the sound. These examples can serve to dispel the popular myth that Chinese characters are purely pictorial when in fact they provide the reader with hints for meaning and pronunciation. Now, the Chinese system began as strictly pictorial, but as it was developed over the century, for clarity's sake, it developed in this direction where the majority of symbols became compounds of meaning and sound. So several factors contributed to the spread of Chinese script: the creation of a large body of writing, the invention of paper, and the use of printing to create copies. Classical Chinese literature gained prestige and recognition in East Asia. Now, when I'm talking about printing, I'm not talking about Gutenberg in the 15th century. I'm talking about in the earlier centuries AD. Classical Chinese literature gained prestige and recognition in East Asia. The script spread primarily to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Vietnamese belongs to the same language family as Chinese and is a tonal language, so adaptation to it wasn't that difficult. Korean and Japanese have a structure that differs fundamentally from Chinese, and both of them struggled with fitting Chinese writing to their language. However, the prestige of Chinese literature basically forced their hands. Eventually, a special syllabic system called Hangul was created for Korean, and today it's the prevailing writing system. Japanese absorbed a large number of Chinese words as it adopted the Chinese script. The difficulty of using Chinese characters was eventually resolved by adding special syllabic characters called the kana syllabaries, specifically two of them, hiragana and katakana. The Japanese also added a new layer of complexity to Chinese writing by allowing some characters to have two meanings, two readings, one Chinese and the other native Japanese. So in this sense, it's much more complex than original Chinese, which always carries a single meaning. Finally, the flexibility of the Chinese writing system was used to create exclusively Japanese characters. Now let's leave China for a while and head west to India for a drastically different model of writing. We arrive in India in the 3rd century BC during the reign of the famous king Ashoka. Edicts of this king have been found in both Aramaic and Greek languages. There's undisputed evidence of the presence of these two alphabets in India at the time, when we're talking about the 3rd century BC. The Greek alphabet composed of consonants and vowels, and Aramaic composed of consonants only. In this environment, a new script called Brahmi appeared. It doesn't match either of the models of the existing alphabets. It was something completely new. Now, as you can see, these are images of engravings found in India, dated to that period. And you can see there are inscriptions in the Greek language, inscriptions in the new Brahmi script, and two of them in the Aramaic script. How is this new script? How does this new script differ from others? This new script called Brahmi. What is the logic behind it? We don't know who invented it, very much like the Proto-Semitic alphabet. We don't know, but I'm going to give the inventor a nice Sanskrit name, Sushil. Here's Sushil's new idea. When we write a consonant by itself, why don't we just assume that it's paired with a vowel? The vowel is so common. Let's make that our norm. Let's call it the natural vowel. So if I write the letter ka, letter K, I really mean ka as a syllable with that vowel. When another vowel needs to combine with a consonant, Only then do we attach a small mark to the consonant to indicate it. That takes less room than using a full letter for the vowels, as Greek, for example. So let's review this pattern for the consonant K. So here you can see this letter form, which looks like a plus, representing the K. The first neutral one means ka. The second one has a long a, ka, short e, ki, ke, ko, ku, short u, and long u, ku. And then what if I want to make it sound nasal, kan? I would put this dot on top. So the resulting combination is a syllable in each case. And this syllable in Sanskrit came to be called the akshara. That's the combination of a consonant with a vowel, or the consonant by itself with an inherent vowel. So what happens if a syllable starts with a vowel alone, like at the start of a word, a name like Ashoka, the A is at the beginning of the word? In those cases, we use an independent letter form for each vowel. So this happens only at the beginning of words, okay? So we would write Ashoka beginning with this symbol. And the various vowels that were used at that time for Sanskrit are listed here. So short A, long A, short E, long E, A, O, short U, long U, and then any kind of nasalization was added with this circular dot. Now let's move on to writing a full word. If I want to write a name like Kamala, I think most of you are familiar with that name by now, I would write it as a sequence based on the 3 consonants. So here we have Ka, K, M, L, each of them with the implicit vowel A. So this would spell Kamala, okay? Let's say if Kamala wakes up one day and wants to change her name to Kamila, we would simply add a symbol for the E vowel to the M consonant, and she would become Kamila. Now, if her friends start to nickname her Kumala, we could simply go back to the K, add an U vowel to it, and we have Kumala. So you see how this is a very flexible way of writing based on syllables, and each word is based on a skeletal form of consonants with vowels added as needed. This new system was effective and readily grasped. It came to be called the Brahmi system, Brahmi writing system. It spread around the Indian subcontinent. When I say Indian subcontinent, I mean this huge peninsula here. The Sanskrit language, as used in Buddhist writings, was a main instrument in its spread, and later on also Hindu scriptures. The first circle of influence of Brahmi writing, inside the first circle of influence, which is the Indian subcontinent, many different scripts developed based on the system in that area. They all represented Sanskrit. They all did, but also different regional languages. They were all visually different, but structurally identical. In the second circle of influence, Southeast Asia, which today would be Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Here we see various forms: Cambodian, Thai, Burmese, and I'm going to include this area as well, which is the Indonesian islands. Similar writing systems sprang up based on the same concept of the Brahmi system. Now, interestingly enough, the third circle of influence is quite distant, and it's Japan, East Asia. So the indirect influence came centuries later, obviously through the study of Buddhist writings. People became familiar with the concept of syllables. And in Japan, the kana writing, the syllabic writing, which I mentioned earlier, has certain characteristics that betray the influence of Brahmi writing. Each of the symbols you see here represents a syllable. So it's different in the sense that it's not the same consonantal skeleton with an addition of a vowel. Each syllable represents the intersection of a row and a column. So this is tsu, for example, tu, the T and the U. This is ka. This is ma. This is mo. So we have on the left the series of vowels in Japanese, and on top we have the columns representing the series of consonants. Now, the concept of a syllable obviously is also borrowed. What would be interesting to notice here to people that are familiar with Japanese writing is that this order, called the Go-Juon, was devised by Buddhist monks, and they follow a sequence similar to that in Sanskrit. Of course, not all Sanskrit sounds exist in Japanese, but those that do are roughly in the same order here. The other interesting concept is that there are syllables that are strictly vowels. So here we have 5 symbols representing the 5 basic vowels in Japanese, and each one is a syllabic symbol by itself. Now we come to the final circle of influence in Ethiopian writing. Now, this is hypothetical, so this is not confirmed truth that I'm showing you, but it's a reasonable hypothesis. If you remember, we looked at South Arabian writing, which the Saba people took with them into the Horn of Africa, and currently Ethiopia and Eritrea. That consonantal system eventually turned into a syllabic system. If we look at the first column here, this is more or less the neutral column with an a sound or without. This is basically the unadorned form, let's say, of this h letter. And as you can see, as we progress from column to column, each of these little marks that are circle represent a vowel sound. So this is hu, this is he, this is ha, this is he, this is h, this is ho. And likewise across the rows. What is different from the Brahmi system here is that the system is taught as attached, very much like kana, except in contrast to kana, one can see that the form, the basic form, crosses all the vowel combinations. It's not a new form for each combination. around 400 AD, Ethiopic script suddenly changed from consonantal to syllabic. What factors do we know about that might have been behind this influence? There were commercial ties between the Ethiopian kingdom and Indian merchants. There were no other syllabic systems in the area, in East Africa or in Arabia. The speed of change doesn't account for a gradual development, but for a relatively fast adoption. If the change is influenced by the presence of Greek or Coptic, as some people speculate, why didn't they just add letters for vowels? Why didn't they just make it a fully vocalic alphabet? We don't know. This is an interesting subject for further research for someone who would want to do that. In this brief overview, we've seen three types of writing: alphabets, syllabaries, and phonosemantic writing. We've seen that when more people need to write, they tend to simplify letter forms. So we see repeatedly the change from pictorial symbols to more abstract symbols. We've also observed there are many ways of representing spoken language in writing, and all of these different ways can be learned by humans. Nowhere do we see any strictly pictorial writing representing language. There's always some phonetic element involved. Now, if you notice, there were some concepts that were common between Chinese and ancient Egyptian. For example, the use of the category, where, for example, in ancient Egyptian, the symbol for house could also be dwelling or place, location. In Chinese, the symbol for woman could just mean feminine. So some of these ideas that are common between writing systems that never had any contact with each other. There are many ways. Nowhere do we see pictorial writing winning the day. Now, I'm going to close my talk here by posing a question to you, which I think many people are thinking about nowadays. Do you think that emoji will become the new world script, replacing all others? Thank you.
Thank you, Kamal. That's a good question. The emoji question. After how many?
I would like to pose another question.
Yes.
Did any of you notice any jokes?
In this one, yeah. So yeah, right. This is a good question. In terms of the evolution of writing overall, cross-cultural, across the globe. I mean, that's the question I had actually. That the ease of writing. How they obviously from pictorial to the abbreviated versions. I mean, that's the commonality. From your perspective, Kamal, any of the various language things that we looked at, which one do you think sort of made that transition, perhaps from the pictorial to the abstract in the quickest way? Perhaps that's a tough question.
Quickest way?
Yeah.
I would say the alphabet, definitely.
I'm sorry?
I would say the alphabet. So the Phoenician, Proto-Semitic to Phoenician, that transition.
That's a quick transition. Yeah. What is a typical? What is like a typical? I don't know, typical, but what is that progression typically? How many hundreds of years, thousands of years do you think typically?
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
It's only hundreds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's only hundreds. I think this is an interesting question that I think affects graphic design very heavily. So I'm going to answer it from that perspective. If I'm representing, if I want to show representation of a common object, but I want to simplify it, I want to streamline it, okay? I still have to show enough of its features that other people will look at the simplified version and understand what I mean, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
We see this in logos all the time. You have a cutout of a face that's incomplete and we fill it in. You have a depiction of a cube by just showing 2 or 3 lines, right? So the progression of alphabets or any form of writing from pictorial to abstract has to progress slowly enough that at no time the audience loses sight of the meaning.
Right.
So I can't suddenly represent a cube with a circle and expect people to understand that I meant cube. But maybe if I do it slowly enough, I could do some other polygonal form that eventually comes to be recognized as the same. But I have to do it very slowly, right? So that I have people following my changes, steps, and not in one abrupt change that's unrecognizable.
All right, it is a language after all, right? It has to be read.
Sorry, I didn't.
Does anyone else have
There's a
questions?
lot of echo.
Oh, sorry. Questions from anyone here? We'll read them. Any questions for Kamal? Or online, any questions?
So what maybe the students can express their ideas. Do you think we could switch to emoji as a new script for all languages?
Right.
I don't think so, just because oftentimes emojis are more used to like to use along with text to show tone or emotion with the text message rather than replacing it itself. So I don't think it'll be used it could ever get to the point of being its own language.
So if I could ask you, what is it missing? What are emoji missing?
Well, the problem is that emojis are like letters. They're like words. So I guess there's just not enough to communicate about everything.
Thing is also, I feel like age demographics have a lot to do with it, just because an emoji for one, like let's say, like older people will use emojis much differently than like the younger generation would be, and there's a lot of different meanings depending on like the text that goes along with it. Like a crying emoji could either mean laughter or actual sadness depending on the contents, so on the context. So like there's a lot of different meanings that's very vague, and the only way to know exactly what that means is if it's used along with the text, and then you can kind of just connect the dots. So yeah.
So it's sort of used like a sauce on a
Yeah.
food. It accentuates.
Yeah, that's accentuates.
So text can sometimes be unclear in emotion, and by putting an emoji in, you basically tell it which way you're leaning.
Yeah.
This is sad or happy or surprise, or you complement what alphabet is missing. Okay.
I was just gonna say that we do use emojis sometimes instead of a word. So like, I don't know if you talk about what we should eat, you definitely can use like an emoji of a burger or something to communicate like single words.
Yes.
Not like full communication.
Yes. When one symbol or look or whatever is enough to convey what you have in mind.
Yeah.
So I like to think of emoji and like to compare them maybe to bones. If we say the emoji are a skeleton, they don't hold together except with additional muscles and tendons and soft tissue. So sometimes one bone will be enough to convey a meaning. But if I put an emoji of a cat next to a woman, I don't know if that means the cat went to the woman, or the cat belongs to the woman, or the woman belongs to the cat, or whatever. The relationships are not easily clarified. So it's very similar to why the Japanese introduced kana together with Chinese writing, in that they have verb endings and prepositions, things of that sort, which are not represented in Chinese because Chinese uses a different structure, but which are essential for Japanese. And by adding them to Chinese characters, basically, they would say something like cat, mine, and then followed by woman. Okay, so basically it ties things together instead of having things appear as solitary images or states or pictures. So humans are always striving to do that. I see there are some things in the chat. Shall I address these?
Yes, that's a good question, right? Why do they have no punctuation? Overall, or specific language?
This is punctuation is a very late comer in writing. It's interesting. We need to keep in mind how literate of a society we live in, and we often really don't appreciate that because text appears to us in very mature forms. So if I may point out here, show, for example, all these samples of text, the Greek, there are, at that time, there were no word spaces even. So writing was not necessarily something for the faint-hearted. Basically, they said, if you know the language already, you should be able to figure out where words begin and end, okay? So why would you need punctuation? Okay, so it means, I mean, it's a bit snobbish, but basically it said, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, get out. So, but that begins to fail as more and more readers join the crowd, okay? So you realize, okay, so now the community of readers is not uniform. There are some people that are expert scholars and others that are still learning. So things like word spaces got introduced. Comma and punctuation, I think, began to appear only in Roman writing. Okay, there were a few symbols introduced, like the and an earlier form of the and sign and so on. It took a long time for that to happen, but as reading and writing became more widespread and democratic, the idea of punctuation came in. It's a very late idea, but now it's adopted by most writing systems in the world. But there are still many scripts that do not separate words. If you read Thai or Burmese or Japanese, words run together, okay? Punctuation happens at the level of the phrase and not necessarily at the word level. So not all languages have spaces between words.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
What do you think is the easiest writing system to learn?
Easiest writing system to learn. Well, probably the alphabet. I wouldn't necessarily tell you which alphabet. I think they're equally learnable. If you were to ask me what is the most natural way of breaking up, of representing sounds, though, I would not tell you the alphabet. I would tell you syllables. I think, this is my personal opinion, this is not science here. So I think the syllable as a sound is an intuitive unit. And we see that in the development of a baby's speech. You know, they say ma, da, ba, bi. How you write that is a different issue, but what's remarkable in the invention of the first alphabet, which is all consonants, if you think about it in terms of phonetics, just the sounds. If you think of a sound stream like, I'm just going to say, interject the sound P between the sound vowel A, I'll say pa, 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 pa. The P basically represents what we hear as a P is an interruption in the sound stream. So it's, whereas the majority of what we hear is the vowel, the ah, pa, pa. And here this guy is able to abstract the interruptions. So if you think of the sound stream as a picket fence, the open spaces are the vowels and the pickets are the consonants. Consonants in some way obstruct the sound stream. And the way they obstruct the sound stream from our mouth, they basically create a sound that we hear in a particular way. So it's very abstract. It's a very abstract invention to be able to list all the interruptions of the vowel stream of a particular language. It's not a trivial accomplishment. Unless you come up with a new writing system, you don't realize how difficult and complex that is. And we're probably talking about a person who had no education.
Great, thank you, Kamal. Any other questions or points? What we've heard today? Great. Do you have any questions for us, Kamal?
Any questions? I really want to know whether you caught any of the jokes.
What jokes did we catch? I know one. I caught one in the beginning, for sure. About the woman.
And which one was that?
This is Rosetta there, I think was one, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes, and what was the joke?
Well, there was no Mrs. Rosetta, right? Or Miss Rosetta.
Yeah, there is no person.
There is no Rosetta.
I've admired that cartoon for many years, but yeah, of course, there's no person named Rosetta.
We got the actual story where it got that from, but yeah, I don't know this is Rosetta.
But if you notice, Rosetta was good in history, and for that reason, she knew where Napoleon's soldiers
Yeah,
would
exactly.
pass. Maybe her class was called Futures, not History.
Yeah, right. Oh, and the other one now, I've got to think back now.
Well, the Ahirom also had no chance
Okay.
of attending evening classes at the Sinai Institute,
Sinai Institute, right. That's another one, yeah.
which obviously didn't exist at the time.
Oh, right, that's barren, right? To say the least. Okay, great, and no questions, great. Thank you, Kamal. Again, it's such a complex topic, obviously, it's interesting to see some of the commonalities and, the systems as they evolve, the abbreviation we get from pictographic to, to language, phonetic, et cetera, it's an interesting journey, to say the least. Complex.
Yes,
And yeah, who knows, 1,000 or 500 years from now, the emoji language combination of all the things we talked about as a new language, perhaps,
yes. So in 100 years, we may lose the handwritten forms of writing.
Pretty sure of that. Just gonna handwrite stuff.
It's very possible those will become exotic
Decorative
pieces displayed in art galleries.
become hieroglyphics or foreign language.
Yes, they'll be what rich people hang on their walls.
Exactly, right. The museum or on the wall. Great. No other questions. We'll wrap it up. Thank you so much, Kamal, for your insight and time. I'm very thorough. I appreciate it. And yeah, I will catch up with you, Kamal. I'll talk to Adele. We'll follow up. I will. If anyone's interested, I'm recording this also, so we can refer back.
Okay.
If there are no other questions, we'll have a session here then.
Okay. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Kamal. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
For our class, we're going to come back and do our link. Okay, thank you.
If
Thank you.
John,
Yes.
I will give you. You may give my email to the students
Oh, yes, absolutely.
if they think of other questions later on
Great.
that
Thank
they
you.
would like to discuss. I'd be happy to
Great.
receive their questions.
Great. Thank you, Kamal. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I'll follow up with you as well. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good rest of your day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.